I just want to introduce the president of Georgetown. Somebody said to me yesterday, how did you get Jack DeGioia here? You must be able to do miracles. Well, I think we got Jack DeGioia here because he's got a love for Oxford, a love for this kind of subject, and a love for his own university and for learning. And he's been supporting the series all the way through. He's been supporting us all the way through since 2018. Anyway, Jack's going to talk to us a bit later, but now he's going to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks,
Jack DeGioia.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for being here. It is an honor to be able to spend this day with you and engage in the wide range of insights and reflections of our colleagues on the Christian literary imagination. And if you'll forgive me for a moment, I just have lots of folks to say thank you to, and I don't get that many opportunities like this. This has been such a collaborative effort, a partnership among our institutions, Campion Hall, Blackfriars Hall, the La Casas Institute, the Future of Humanities Project and the Georgetown Humanities Initiative, and the Georgetown Master's Program in the Engaged in Public Humanities. And the leadership of our colleagues has been invaluable. Nick Austin and Campion Hall, especially as we've learned as they're celebrating their 125th anniversary, and John O'Connor, their 800th anniversary. Timothy, what an honor to have you with us and to be able to just to listen to your reflections was a grace for all of us, and I'm just honored to be able to be here with you. To Carol Broom Saunders and Bonnie Lander Johnson and Christopher Jameson and Graham Ward and Joseph Simmons, all who have participated, we want to thank you for your contributions and presentations. And to my colleagues from Georgetown, Mark Bosco and Julia Lamb and Kathy Temple, Tom Banshoff, Michael Collins, and Sandy Unger, I thank you all for your contributions, your presentations, your presence at this special convening. And special thanks to Michael Scott and to Maggie Scott for all of their efforts to bring us together and to make this possible. Mike, we couldn't be more excited about the publication of the new books. Grateful for those contributions to our work, for the vision that you've set forth for the Future of the Humanities Project, and the collaboration that has led to this gathering. So thank you. I have the responsibility this afternoon of introducing Rowan Williams, the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, a role that he held for a decade from 2002 to 2012. Difficult to capture in just a few words the breadth and depth of his contributions as a religious leader, a scholar and writer, a poet, and thinker deeply immersed in spirituality, Christian theology, meditations on the meaning of our shared lives. And this convening, which asks us to explore the Christian literary imagination and the role of the arts and humanities on our individual and on our collective experiences, I can think of no one better to engage these questions than him, and today through a deep engagement with poetry. I'd also just like to mention another dimension of this moment for me. Mike just mentioned my love for this place. I've been affiliated with Georgetown University since I was 18 years old. It's been my life. I started to work in administration 40 years ago, just last week. And my role at that time was as assistant to our president, Father Timothy Healy. I had known Father Healy as a student. I had studied poetry. He was an English professor in addition to being our president. I came here for the first time with him in roughly 1984. 20 years prior to that, he was a student at Campion Hall, working on his DPhil with Dame Helen Gardner. And he wrote on another metaphysical poet, John Donne, and his work was a translation and a commentary on John Donne's Ignatius, his Conclave. If you're not familiar with it, it's a satire, it's a doozy, I'll spare you. But if you knew Father Healy, you would know that if you were going to take on a piece of work, that would have been it. And it actually sits on my desk in my office in Washington. It's just a wonderful sort of connection to your talk today. Back to my introduction. In 2000, he served as Archbishop of Wales. In 2002, became Archbishop of Canterbury, and then following his conclusion of his service there, became the 35th Master of Magdalen College at Cambridge, where he served until 2020. As you all know, a prolific writer. I could go through a list and I would eat up all of our time for today's talk, but I will just mention he did spend a month with us on sabbatical in our Jesuit community at Georgetown. And, normally when we ask folks, to come and spend a little time, we just hope they can get some rest. And he left having written a book on Dostoevsky during that period.
That was a rest.
From your responsibilities at that time, it was. At Georgetown, we've had the privilege of working with him on a special project related to interfaith dialogue between Muslims and Christians. When our world needed it most, as Archbishop of Canterbury, he made an extraordinary commitment to supporting interfaith engagement, and for all of the years of his service as Archbishop, led the Building Bridges Seminar, a convening of Muslim and Christian scholars coming together to engage deeply in the study of Muslim and Christian scriptural study, and also the theological reflections and perspective from the two different traditions. We're honored to continue his legacy by providing a continuing home for this seminar at Georgetown. I've always found solace in his reflections on our journey as people of faith, our interconnectedness as people. In one of his works, Silence and Honeycakes, he focused on the 4th century desert fathers and mothers and their journey in the desert. And I found great inspiration in these words, and let me quote: "The truth is that we shall only understand the balance of severity and confidence, of the strenuous and the relaxed, in the context of the common life. Every believer must have an urgent concern for the relation of the neighbor to Christ, a desire and willingness to be the means by which Christ's relation with the neighbor becomes actual and transforming." Close quote. We're privileged to have Rowan Williams with us to offer his thinking across all aspects of his life. You can see an integration of his deep knowledge and engagement with Christian theology and religious life, his expertise as a teacher and professor, his perspectives as a writer, scholar, and poet, and his deep care for our world. For many years, among his many pursuits, has been focused on the 17th century metaphysical poet Henry Vaughan and the place of spirituality and religion in his work. So please join me in welcoming the Right Reverend, the Right Honorable, Dr. Rowan Williams.
Thank you so much, Jack, for a typically generous introduction, and thank you for so much more over the last 20 years in terms of friendship and support and inspiration. And thanks also to all those who've been involved in organizing this wonderful event from which I've already learned so very much. It's been a real delight to sit at the feet of so many people. I feel the usual qualms that a last speaker at the end of the afternoon is likely to feel about the probable level of attention in the audience, but you've had a good tea. And if the cake begins to weigh your eyelids down, so be it. I'm going to speak about Henry Vaughan, metaphysical poet, doctor, Welsh-speaking Welshman, one of the less celebrated of the metaphysical poets of the 17th century for a long time, and yet in his way, an extraordinarily distinctive and even innovative poetic writer. His long life spanned the entire 17th century conflict. He lived through the Civil War, the Commonwealth, the Restoration. He was, like a lot of people from his class and his background in Wales, a royalist. He fought in the Civil War, and his brother, who was a priest, was ejected from his position as a parish priest after the Puritan victory and died shortly thereafter. Vaughan himself settled to a very obscure life in the Usk Valley in mid-Wales, working as a country physician. Don't say it too loudly, but he doesn't actually seem to have had any medical qualifications. Although he's occasionally described in published versions of his work as MD, Doctor of Medicine, there's absolutely no evidence from Oxford that he ever took this degree. And the chances are that his medical work was very much the deposit of a kind of folk wisdom and what we might now call homeopathic medicine. His brother, his twin brother, Thomas, who, as I said, died at the end of the Civil War, Thomas was an alchemist and philosopher and all-round eccentric. And given that the bar is very high, I think we would still have to say possibly one of the most bad-tempered people of the 17th century, who managed to alienate pretty well everybody else who was interested in his topics. His work, Thomas's work, is impenetrably complicated, irascible, lively, hugely readable, and hugely boring all at once, because it's mostly work about cosmology. Thomas Vaughan was fascinated by the Hermetic and pseudo-mystical traditions that flourished so much in Europe in the 16th and early 17th centuries. He has what you might broadly call a magical view of the material world, and he builds on this to produce some wonderfully, as I say, lively and fanciful, and often also over-elaborate models of what the universe is like. Thomas's many works seem to have had some influence on his brother, unsurprisingly. And I'll mention just in passing as I go through one or two areas where Henry Vaughan seems to have picked up some of the themes and concerns of his twin brother. Henry was certainly not one of the most bad-tempered men of the 17th century, but he probably was one of the most bad-tempered Welshmen of the 17th century. And it's one of the great mysteries, connecting with the question that came up at the end of the last session, one of the great mysteries that somebody capable of such transcendentally reconciled, beautiful and peaceful poetry was capable of quarrelling with in-laws, disinheriting his daughter, and any number of things which remained typical of Welsh families in that region until the middle of the 20th century. I come from the same area of South to Mid Wales originally, so some strangely familiar things about Henry Vaughan's life. Now, Vaughan began writing as a poet as a relatively young man, and his early works as a poet are frankly not very interesting. They're exercises in a reasonably polished, rather conventional style. It's, if you like, a slightly scaled-down version of early Milton. Scaled down because the early Milton is as brilliant as the later Milton in a completely different way. And Vaughan does the regular pentameters very nicely, but doesn't do very much exciting with them. But an illness, a personal crisis, and a crisis of faith led him to read the poetry of George Herbert, a generation older than Henry Vaughan, and Vaughan's poetic voice shifts completely. And most of the rest of his poetic work is a reworking of George Herbert. Now, we've been hearing about revision earlier this afternoon to very interesting effect. A great deal of Vaughan's major collection, Silex Scintillans, the sparkling flint, is in fact best described as almost a shuffling of the material of George Herbert's The Temple to make new poems. Again and again, as you read Vaughan, you think, just a moment, isn't that a quotation from Herbert? And you look it up and it is, but Vaughan is doing something very different with it. And the Vaughan who begins with this almost sausage machine approach to poetry, turning out the neat regular pentameters, Vaughan suddenly becomes, like Herbert, a metrical innovator who can, from poem to poem, shift the pattern and the music and the energy with enormous effect. Well, I hope to introduce you to some of Vaughan's poetry as I go through this, but my theme is a theme which Vaughan addresses in three ways, at three levels. Broadly speaking, the theme of absence or of loss. What has gone missing is a question which Vaughan addresses in three contexts. The first is what has gone missing from my personal life. And that's very specifically connected in some of these poems with the loss of his brother. The second is what has gone missing in the life of adult human beings in general. And that leads into a reflection on childhood and what you might call the false maturity into which we think we grow as human beings. And that then opens out a bit more deeply into what have we lost since the childhood of the human race. A very poignant and recurrent theme in Vaughan's poetry. And thirdly, there's what have we lost in church? A lot of Vaughan's poetry is written during the period of the Commonwealth, when the liturgy and sacraments of the Anglican Church in which he'd grown up were prescribed by law. And one very, very interesting way of expressing Vaughan's response to that, which a number of scholars have picked up, is the idea that Vaughan in his poetry is, as it were, creating a church in words. He is creating a system of symbolic reference and metaphorical depth, theological and spiritual insight, which, as it were, surrounds the poetic speaker and gives them that environment of insight into the mysteries of God, which the regular liturgy once gave. But more of that in a moment. I want to begin with two of his poems about his own bereavement, what's gone missing in his own life. And the two are called appropriately Absence and Bereavement. They're both poems almost certainly about his brother's death. They're certainly about human loss, and a datable human loss. He speaks of how long it's been. This is a little bit of a sideline, but I just mention it in passing. The first of these, Absence, it hasn't been widely noticed, but it has a number of, I say, unmistakable verbal echoes, not from George Herbert, but from another poet of the period, Henry King, who became Bishop of Chichester in the Caroline era, and one of whose poems was a long elegy for his dead wife, the Exequy. An extraordinarily beautiful poem, very chilling at various points. And what made me think of it was that, well, there are two phrases in the Exequy which are relevant here. One is the couplet, which King addresses to his dead wife. And lo, my pulse, like a soft drum, beats my approach, tells thee I come. And the other couplet is, no wonder if my time go thus, backward and most preposterous. Preposterous back to front in the 17th century sense. So, the poet there is telling the departed that he's coming. And that wonderful soft drum image speaks of that. And meanwhile, it's as if time is running backwards towards a reunion. So, all sorts of poetic tensions there. The poet is advancing towards death and retreating towards the relationship he's lost. Now then, what does Vaughan do with absence? Listen to the rhymes. Come, come. What do I hear? Since he is gone, each day is grown a dozen year, and each hour one. Come, come, cut off the sun by these soiled tears, which only thou knowst to be true. Days are my fears. There's not a wind can stir or beam pass by, but straight, I think, though far, thy hand is nigh. Come, come, strike these lips dumb. This restless breath that soils thy name will ne'er be tame until in death. Perhaps some think a tomb, no house of store, but a dark and sealed up womb which ne'er breeds more. Come, come, such thoughts benumb, but I would be with him I weep abed, and sleep to wake in thee. Surely, I say to myself, he'd been reading the exequy. Surely. The theme, the rhyme, the one word that doesn't come in there is drum, but it's the rhyme that you're listening for, as it were, or I am. And if you think that tomb and womb in the 17th century would not have been all that distinguishable from how come and some would have been pronounced, well, you see the point. So once again, Vaughan is doing some rewriting here. But what's going on here? The tomb and the womb are interwoven, and the tomb becomes the fertile reality. It's in death and silence that something will begin to breed, something will begin to shift and grow and return. And on the other hand, days are my fears. It's the deceptively bright daylight, the deceptively vivid colours of life, which actually soil the reality of the relationship he's celebrating. Something is made less than it is, less clear than it is, less pure than it is, by the day's work. The day, the light, as we experience it, the ordinary environment we're in, is sterile. A kind of clarity becomes the enemy of expectation and even the enemy of truth. And we'll come back again and again to this theme of clarity of a certain kind being the enemy of truth. Because the light of day, given the way our minds and our hearts work here and now, is always going to be much more ambivalent than we think it is. And if we turn from that to bereavement, we have, again, the theme of going backward. Remember King's backward and most preposterous. I won't read all of it, but just a little. Silence and stealth of days. 'Tis now since thou art gone 1200 hours, and not a brow but clouds hang on. As he that in some cave's thick damp locked from the light fixeth a solitary lamp to brave the night, and walking from his sun, when past that glimmering ray, cuts through the heavy mists in haste back to his day. So to unscramble that very tight metaphor there, imagine you've lit a candle in your remote home. You've gone out to your work. The sun sets. Going down behind you is the sun. Ahead of you is the candle in your house, the point of orientation at the heart of where you are and where you live. And that's what you're going back to. The trouble is, as Vaughan goes on to say, when you get back, the candle's been snuffed out. That deep point of orientation or integrity in life has gone. Nothing but the snuff to me appeareth plain. So what do you do? Somewhere there is light, somewhere the departed souls shine and burn, as he says. Oh, could I track them? But souls must track one the other. So whether we know it or not, our souls are still tracking the light. There's something in us turning almost subterraneanly towards the light. And now the spirit, not the dust, must be thy brother. The dead body of the dead brother is actually no longer the brother. The brother is the spirit. The brother is the light, the motion that you can't see, and yet which is in some sense drawing you after. And all of that is drawn together wonderfully in the last 4 lines. Yet I have one pearl, by whose light all things I see, and in the heart of earth and night find heaven and thee. So the all-embracing reality and work of Christ connects the speaker with the departed brother, that center of love and integrity and all the rest of it, And somehow, in the heart of earth at night, it's possible to find a homecoming. So long as you don't delude yourself that you can see clearly, that it's all straightforward, and that you can have it all now. So, those poems of personal bereavement begin to explain how and why Vaughan sees poetry itself as a kind of defamiliarizing of what's around you, a kind of complication of what seems simple, and even a sort of clouding over of what seems clear. You might think that's a very strange program for poets to embark on, but I hope you'll see as we go on what Vaughan is doing with this. So, moving on to Vaughan's generalization of this experience. Those are poems, as I say, of personal bereavement, related to his brother's death. But much more generally, Vaughan returns to the theme of the loss that we all experience when we look back. So one of the rather later and slightly less adventurous poems in the collection called the Thalia, or Pious Thoughts and Ejaculations, one of those is called Looking Back. And he looks back, as he does in several of his poems, to a lost childhood. Fair shining mountains of my pilgrimage, and flowery vales whose flowers were stars, the days and nights of my first happy age, an age without disaster or wars, when I by thoughts ascend your sunny heads, and mind those sacred midnight lights by which I walked, when curtained rooms and beds confined or sealed up others' sights. The sacred midnight lights are the stars, of course, and Vaughan is a great poet of the stars. I've written elsewhere about how he picks up some of the wilder speculations of his brother about how stars are actually little holes in the sky through which liquid fire streams down. And the liquid fire image is one that Vaughan loves to use when he writes about the stars. He loves the night time. He loves the brightness of the stars in the pitch black Usk Valley. And here he is looking back, not strangely to the light of childhood, but the darkness of childhood, the star-filled skies of childhood. And he walks under those stars when everybody else is asleep. The first happy age with those sacred midnight lights. And that theme of a first happy age, a lost age, is most poignantly expressed in what's possibly one of his best-known poems, The Retreat. Again, I won't read all of it, but just to give you a flavour. Happy those early days when I shined in my angel infancy, before I understood this place appointed for my second race, or taught my soul to fancy aught but a white celestial thought, when yet I had not walked above a mile or two from my first love, and looking back at that short space, could see a glimpse of his bright face. In childhood, you can look back to where you came from, that is the hand of God, and sense the light from which you come. And then, of course, you grow up. All this is before I taught my tongue to wound my conscience with a sinful sound, or had the black art to dispense a several sin to every sense, but felt through all this fleshly dress bright shoots of everlastingness. Oh, how I long to travel back and tread again that ancient track, that I might once more reach that plain where first I left my glorious train. Some men a forward motion love, but I by backward steps would move. And when this dust falls to the urn, in that state I came, return. Backward movement, back to the beginning, back to the source, back to the light of God. And as I say very poignantly there, you have that image of the short gap, the very short gap between the newborn soul and God. The short space when yet I had not walked above a mile or two from my first love. It's a lovely picture that God has sort of ushered the newborn soul out into the world, and it's wandering innocently through this great plain with angels all around. And when it looks back, there's God. So it is, as I say, a theme that he will recur to, and another poignant poem about it is Childhood, which adds another little dimension to what we've just been talking about. And it begins with a very typical habit of Vaughan's, which he takes from Herbert and uses in a way even more creatively. Herbert often, as you'll remember, begins his poems with a sort of abrupt address. I struck the board and cried no more. Well, Vaughan does this in much the same way. And here he begins by saying, I cannot reach it. And my striving eye dazzles at it as at eternity. I can't get back. I can see what childhood was like. I can recall that transparency, but I can't get there. I can't actually inhabit it any longer. And the poem Childhood then goes on to reflect on this and reflect on the irony that as we grow, apparently, we actually shrink our mental and spiritual and imaginative resources. And for some extraordinary reason, we seem to love what harms us. Why should men love a wolf more than a lamb or dove? He asks, or choose hellfire and brimstone streams before bright stars again, and God's own beam. Who kisseth thorns will hurt his face, but flowers do both refresh and grace. What is it that makes us so perverse, not only living with loss, but intensifying that loss by the choices we continue to make in what we delude ourselves is maturity? So he remembers that in childhood, there is no fixed sense of ego. And in that childlike state, love without lust dwells, and bends what way we please, without self-ends. Very interesting little couplet, isn't it? Love bends what way we please. Love leads us by what we want, but without the focus on the ego, without self-ends. What we've lost, in other words, is the capacity for unself-conscious enjoyment and receptivity towards the world. We now think, I want that experience because it'll make me feel happy. Whereas when we were children, we had that experience and it made us happy and we couldn't plan it. And now we try to plan it and everything goes wrong. So he looks back to the age when quickly would I make my path even, and by mere playing go to heaven. There's a lovely line to reflect on. By mere playing go to heaven. The child does what comes naturally. The child plays. The child enjoys. The child has no image of the ego to be served. And so, unsurprisingly, indeed, I cannot reach it. I have to recover it, but it's beyond reach. I see, and the poem makes this clear, I see the hints of a light, a center of light, as in the bereavement poem, but it's always elsewhere and elsewhen, if I can coin a word. So our human growing up has that quality to it, but there's something also about the history of our whole religious sensibility, and there's another cluster of Vaughan poems which bear that out. A collective story of loss, not just human loss in general, but the loss of the immediacy of God that seems to come through in the early pages of Scripture. Once again, what have we lost? What's not around any longer? And the answer is a God who speaks with us, relates to us, as a man speaks to his friend, in the old scriptural phrase. A poem called Religion. My God, when I walk in those groves and leaves thy spirit doth still fan, I see in each shade that there grows an angel talking with a man. Under a juniper some house, or the cool myrtle's canopy, others beneath an oak's green boughs, or at some fountain's bubbling eye, Here Jacob dreams and wrestles, there Elias by a raven is fed, another time by the angel where he brings him water with his bread. In Abram's tent the winged guests, oh, how familiar then was heaven. Eat, drink, discourse, sit down and rest until the cool and shady even. Once upon a time, it was absolutely natural for God to drop in, and angels too. Everywhere you looked, you could see angels conversing with human beings. So why exactly is that not happening in the 17th century? Vaughan partly blames human sin, but also largely blames Oliver Cromwell, I think, in that he has some rather sharp verses about how the schism in the church has made things yet more difficult for everybody. Religion is a spring that from some secret golden mine derives her birth, and thence doth bring cordials in every drop and wine. But in her long and hidden course, passing through the earth's dark veins, grows still from better unto worse, and both her taste and colour stains. Then drilling on, learns to increase false echoes and confused sounds, and unawares doth often seize on veins of sulphur underground. So, poisoned, breaks forth in some clime, and at first sight doth many please, but drunk is puddle, or mere slime, instead of physic a disease. Just such a tainted sink we have, like that Samaritan's dead well, nor must we for the kernel crave, because most voice is like the shell. Things are pretty bad. The church has been eradicated from Vaughan's point of view. The fountain of clear water, of pure revelation, has been soured and polluted by schism and sin and all the rest of it. So we've lost that immediacy, the angel talking, the familiarity of heaven. But Vaughan is enough of a poet, and I think enough of a theologian, to know that it's not all the fault of the Puritans. And he will return fairly regularly to themes of general loss and loss of immediacy. Because that's what these poems of lost early religious transparency are about. It's the loss of immediacy. We are obliged to think God, speak God, see God obliquely. We are in a situation of mist, unclarity, or eventually night. And we have to embrace that unclarity, that darkness, not try and deny it or force our way through it. This is where we are, Vaughan is saying, poetically, get used to it. We have lost something, and we mustn't pretend. And in that case, pretending that it's clear, pretending that it's pure, pretending that it's manageable, is the worst thing possible. And his poetry comes in, as it were, to say to us, here is how you speak about God. You speak about God looking back, looking forward, and accepting that where you are is dark. But in that darkness, you can at least tell the truth about God, which is that you've lost him. And that's the key truth that poetry has to tell. So a very ironical, very paradoxical scheme of thinking. The way the poet here and now speaks of God is to say, God is what you've lost, and that's what you need to know. And to bring the reality of God alive in this present moment, that's what the poet has to say. As it were, I don't know where he is, but he's not here. That's a very drastic way of putting it, and Vaughan qualifies it in several interesting ways. He will speak of the Spirit still being here. Notice, in those groves and leaves, thy Spirit still doth fan. The problem isn't that God has gone away. The problem is that we are all over the place. And poetry has to bring us somehow back to that recognition. So in this disenchanted world, to use a slightly anachronistic but not entirely inappropriate phrase, in this disenchanted world, poetry's job is not simply to re-enchant. It's to rub our noses in the disenchantment and to say, this is what you've lost. This is the cost of being what you think of as a mature and polished adult. And if that's what you want, well, good luck to you. A couple of other poems related to this. Again, just some brief extracts from a poem called appropriately The Search, which describes the poet wandering as a pilgrim around a number of biblical sites. I have been as far as Bethlehem and have seen his inn and cradle. Being there, I met the wise men, asked them where he might be found, or what star can now point him out, grown up a man. To Egypt hence I fled, ran o'er all her parched bosom to Nile's shore, her yearly nurse. Came back, inquired among the doctors, and desired to see the temple, but was shown a little dust, and for the town a heap of ashes, where some said a small bright sparkle was a bed. And so on. He's wandering around the record of Christ's incarnate life, trying to see where he's gone, to see, as he says, ideas of his agony and moving anguishments that set his blessed face in a bloody sweat. But gradually it sort of wears thin, and he comes to the point. Listen to the Herbert Echo here. As I urged thus, just like as I raged and grew more fierce and wild in one of Herbert's famous poems, as I urged thus and writ down what pleasures should my journey crown, what silent paths, what shades and cells, fair virgin flowers and hallowed wells I should rove in and rest my head, where my dear Lord did often tread, sugaring all dangers with success. Methought I heard one singing thus. So he's looking to an ideal restored immediacy with God, a state of comfort, and he hears one singing. And this little lyric then interrupts the poem as if to say, you think you know what you want from the presence of God, and thinking you know it is exactly that kind of lethal clarity that traps you in your untransfigured, unredeemed state of mind. And the little poem, the little lyric introduced, is a pure bit of Herbert. Leave thy gadding thoughts. Who pause and spies, still out of doors, descries within them naught. The skin and shell of things, though fair, are not thy wish, nor prayer, but got by mere despair of wings. To rack old elements or dust, and say, sure, here he must needs stay, is not the way, nor just. As I say, it's pure Herbert pastiche and very, very skillful. The voice, the singing voice, says, looking outside for God, binding God's presence to this or that context, this or that landscape, is the way to cement your sterility. Sure, here he must needs stay. That's not it. That's not the way. So he ends with a little couplet. Search well another world. Who studies this, travels in clouds, seeks manna where none is. So is this then a recommendation that the poet leaves the actual physical world of the present, turning his or her back on this and looking heavenwards? Well, sometimes, yes, it sounds very like that. But it's also, I think more importantly, an injunction to turn the search and the journey inwards. And you find that as a theme in several of these poems too, the turning inwards. And that turning inwards is to do with the crucial moment for Vaughan of recognizing that you are lost and you have lost something. Turning inwards is recognizing you live in a world from which you are alienated. It's not a matter of turning your back on the world. It's a matter of opening your eyes to the fact that you have turned your back on the world. You are alienated from the world. You have forgotten how to be part of creation. So, not a rejection of creation or of God's presence in creation, But the poet's task is to say, once again, look what you've forgotten. Recognize what you don't have and see what comes from that. Well, many other examples. Here's just a little bit of another one, because I like reading Vaughan, as you may have noticed. It's a poem called Corruption, and it begins with another wonderful Herbertian, abrupt introduction. Sure, it was so. Man in those early days was not all stone and earth. He shined a little, and by those weak rays had some glimpse of his birth. He saw heaven o'er his head, and knew from whence he came condemned hither. And as first love draws strongest, so from hence his mind sure progressed thither. Things here were strange unto him. Sweat and till, all was a thorn or weed, nor did those last, but like himself, died still, as soon as they did seed. So at the beginning, we shined a little. It's a bit less optimistic than the shining infancy of the other poem. We shined a little. By those weak rays had some glimpse. We could look back to where we came from. But already the strangeness of the world is creeping in on us. We're sweating and toiling over it. We're trying to make something of it. And then the things of the world, they seem to quarrel with him. For that act that felled him foiled them all. The fall of Adam ruins everything. Another quite irrelevant side note, if I may. Listen to that line. For that act that felled him foiled them all. Vaughan was a Welsh speaker, and that is a very good example of a classical Welsh metrical device called cynhanedd, in which you use a particular pattern of repeated vowels and consonants in a special arrangement. You have the same consonants and different vowels. Vaughan must have been doing, there are other examples in his poetry, but I mention that because it's a very good one. That felled him foiled them all. So felled and foiled are in assonance, all and felled, him and them. You've got what you'd have to depict in a sort of diagrammatic form in a typical Welsh line. Close brackets. But here we have, once again, the same theme. It's all going wrong. We are alienated from where we are. The world is strange to us. We are quarreling with the world. And as the poem goes on, it gets worse and worse. The clouds are gathering. Sin triumphs still. And man is sunk below the centre and his shroud. All's in deep sleep and night. Thick darkness lies and hatcheth all thy people. And then a very unexpected conclusion. But hark! What trumpets that? What angel cries, arise, thrust in thy sickle? Judgment is coming. Something is impending here. Corruption doesn't just go on down the drain indefinitely. It's a spine-chilling moment at the end of that poem. Anyway, point is, relating this to what I've been saying about Vaughan overall, we're beginning to see, I think, how Vaughan understands the task of the sacred poet. And here, and this is something I come back to again and again and wonder about, here he's possibly at his furthest from Herbert. Herbert is, of course, a Calvinist poet, whatever some may have said, and his Calvinism, paradoxically, leads him to a rather sort of open-eyed embrace of the world as it is. How fresh, O Lord, how sweet and clean are thy returns, welcome as flowers in spring. Well, Vaughan has his moments of that, but on the whole, Vaughan is a much bleaker poet. And because he's not a Calvinist, it's as if his expectations are higher. He wants to see and sense the sacramental world from which he's alienated. Herbert, referring it all blithely to the will of God, is able to say, well, I can't make anything of this, but I embrace what's here. That's my duty as a good Reformed Christian. Vaughan, good High Church Anglican, is not quite happy with that. And we'll see more of that in just a second. So we are, as human beings here and now, out of tune, out of kilter, and to pick up an image from one of the later poems called Man, he hath no root. We have no real anchorage in the world. We have made ourselves strangers in the world by the cultivation of a particular kind of mental and moral ethos, which is continually wrecking and undermining our relationship with creation and our relationship with the Creator. Faith doesn't remove that alienation and the sense of restlessness that goes with it overnight. It fixes on a promised future, a future recovery, so as to give form to our life in the present, and it warns us against mistaking the clarity and light we now are used to in our fallen state with the true clarity and light both of God and of restored creation. So the poetry has a kind of monitory quality. It's a warning. One more aspect, very briefly, of this theme in Vaughan's poetry is just to pick up what I mentioned earlier, the sense of Vaughan's lament for the lost church. You remember, perhaps, that George Herbert wrote a poem called The British Church. I joy, dear mother, when I view thy lineaments. He's looking at the Church of England and, implausibly, finding it a model Christian church. And here, as elsewhere, he's a bit sniffy about those pretenders to Christian authenticity found in Rome and Geneva. It's a bit uncharacteristically for Herbert, quite a triumphalist poem. Vaughan has a poem called The British Church, which could not be more different. It's short, so listen to it. Ah, he is fled. And while these here their mists and shadows hatch, my glorious head doth on those hills of myrrh and incense watch. Haste, haste, my dear, the soldiers here cast in their lots again. That seamless coat the Jews touched not, these dare divide and stain. Oh, get thee wings, or if as yet until these clouds depart and the day springs, thou think'st it good to tarry where thou art, write in thy books my ravished looks, slain flock and pillaged fleeces, and haste thee so as a young roe upon the mounts of spices. Beautiful lyric, but it's all about the church corporately expressing its loss and its grief. And he ends the poem with a little series of apostrophes based on the Song of Solomon. O rosa campi, o lilium convallium, como rununc facta es pabulum aprorum. The lily of the field, the rose. That's the church. How has it become such a desolation? Food for wild beasts. So Christ has, it seems, receded from the church. There he is on those hills of myrrh and incense, watching the dereliction of the church, the ravished looks, the slain flock, the pillaged fleeces. And again, haste, come. So many poems of his have those words and those themes in them. The mystical erotics, as you might say, of the Song of Songs, here applied not to the individual soul, but to a whole Christian community. Vaughan's own church, as he sees it, derelict, persecuted. And the church appeals to Christ to right our losses in his book. Well, time's getting on, I'm afraid, and a lot more could be said, but I think you've perhaps got the main outlines of what Vaughan is doing in these three different ways of talking about loss and absence, and scrolling backwards, backward and most preposterous. You can say, as some have said, that Vaughan is a kind of proto-romantic. One of the great things that divides him from Herbert, who is about as unromantic as they come. And on Herbert's prosaic, ironic, very sophisticated tone is not at all Vaughan's. Vaughan's romantic in the sense that he's looking both backwards and forwards for immediacy. But in the present, all you have is the erotics of yearning. The yearning for the lost transparency of childhood, the yearning for the restored transparency of the vision of God. Here and now, God is present in and under darkness. And yet, the embrace of that darkness is not a negative, a purely penitential matter. If you have once grasped what is going on in the work of poetry, here and now, you will see that, as I said earlier, poetry's job, in Vaughan's eyes, is to tell you that you have lost the truth, to tell you that you are at odds with reality, and to tell you that reality remains reality. God made the world. You've walked away from God. God has not walked away from you. That's the poetic arc, you might say. And poetry, by paradoxically exploring and celebrating exactly these moments of loss, the night, poetry becomes a moment of good news in this, strangely, because a moment of truth. The irony is that poetry, meant to celebrate the world, is most itself and works best in this non-immediate moment. Poetry narrates the processes of loss, begs for revelation and apocalypse. It can't bring it about, but it points to what is there and what is hidden. And perhaps I may conclude then with another of Vaughan's best-known poems, which is the one called Night, the Night. Longish, but not impossibly long. But I hope you'll bear with me if I conclude with this, because it seems to me to bring together so much of what Vaughan is doing. There is a real sensitivity to the beauty and extraordinariness of the world, this repeated celebration of the bright nighttime stars, this critique of a kind of false clarity. It ends with an appeal to dimness, to partial sight. I have to get used to seeing partially, simply because I shouldn't pretend I can see wholly. And if anybody says The Night is a negative poem, I would simply politely ask them to read it again, please. Through that pure virgin shrine, that sacred veil drawn o'er thy glorious noon, that men might look and live as glowworms shine and face the moon, wise Nicodemus saw such light as made him know his God by night. Most blessed believer he, who in that land of darkness and blind eyes thy long-expected healing wings could see when thou didst rise, and what can never more be done, did at midnight speak with the sun. Oh, who will tell me where he found thee at that dead and silent hour? What hallowed solitary ground did bear so rare a flower, within whose sacred leaves did lie the fullness of the deity? No mercy seat of gold, no dead and dusty cherub nor carved stone, but his own living works did my Lord hold and lodge alone, where trees and herbs did watch and peep and wonder, while the Jews did sleep. Dear night, this world's defeat, the stop to busy fools, care's check and curb, the day of spirits, my soul's calm retreat which none disturb, Christ's progress and his prayer time, the hours to which high heaven doth chime, God's silent searching flight, when my Lord's head is filled with dew, and all his locks are wet with the clear drops of night, his still soft call, his knocking time, the soul's dumb watch, when spirits their fair kindred catch. Were all my loud and evil days calm and unhaunted as is thy dark tent, whose peace but by some angel's wing or voice is seldom rent, then I in heaven all the long year would keep, and never wander here. But living where the sun doth all things wake, and where all mix and tire themselves and others, I consent, and run to every mire, and by this world's ill-guiding light, err more than I can do by night. There is in God some say, a deep but dazzling darkness. As men here say, it is late and dusky, because they see not all clear. Oh, for that night where I in him might live invisible and dim. Thank you.
Maybe I can get us started, and then we'll open it up to questions. Your Grace, earlier today, Father Radcliffe said he's never been without a novel. And I'm projecting, but it seems to me you've never been without a poem. And you also write poetry. And when you think about the way you just shared with us, the job of poetry, as you've shared from Henry Vaughan, given your engagement with the practice, what is the job of poetry today? Does Henry Vaughan capture that vision for you, or how would you describe that role today?
I guess that what I might, sorry, am I audible? Is it on? Good, thank you. I guess what I might find in common with Vaughan is that I believe poetry has to unsettle the boundaries of what you're taking for granted and what you're finding comfortable. It has to show that language is always running away from you. And the paradox of writing poetry, I think, is that you are trying to produce an orderly account of a disorderly reality. You're trying to find a sort of rhythmical and metrical pattern of words which expresses the fact that words don't sit still in rhythms and patterns. And I've just actually been finishing another little piece on Herbert, which explores some of how that works itself out in Herbert. But yes, I recognize that in my own practice, that the way of representing the strangeness and the disruption of poetry isn't necessarily to write strange and disrupted stuff. It's to try and find words that will push you towards recognizing the strangeness and disruption in yourself. And occasionally, of course, there is scope, as Herbert certainly shows, for disruptive intrusions in the poetry. And part of what I've been trying to work out with Herbert is the balance in his poetry between what I call orderly poems about disruption and disrupted poems about order. For example, you have a poem by Herbert which ends, my grief exceeds all measure, something rhyme, alas my God. You've had a perfectly regular rhyming sequence, and then the last line is just, alas my God. I don't know how to go on. That's the disruption of an orderly poem. Then you have quite neat, finished poems, which in fact are all about disruption because they kind of edge and elbow and jar and squeak in all sorts of ways. But yes, I think it's that pushing the language beyond what it's immediately comfortable with.
Thank you. Are there questions?
Thank you so much for that. I wasn't aware, I hadn't heard much Vaughan read before. I was just thinking of a similarity of a point that I think Father Timothy was making about Ian McEwan, which seemed a bit surprising. Because if I understood what you're saying about Vaughan, part of what he is doing in his religious poetry is exposing the inadequacy and the discomfort that we are in, and that's actually what points you towards religious longing. And how similar this is to whether McEwan is gesturing towards a longing for completion, for order, for harmony, even if he doesn't believe it's attainable. And whether you then also get that in 20th century poetry by non-believers if it's honest. So whether or not Larkin in that sense can be a religious pointing poem. And I was just thinking of that a disused shed in County Wexford poem of, I think it's Derek Mann, maybe, but similarly a poem that points to the ache.
Yeah. Yes.
Whether that's really doing anything different, or whether any truly human poetry, even if the writer thinks they don't believe in God, is going to bring this ache out.
Gosh, that's a really interesting set of questions rather than one question. Yes, I think I'd say that, let me see, Vaughan is aware, you might say, aware of what's been lost. It's not just a vague aspiration or even just an ache. It is also, once there was something real which I have let go of. And my journey is somehow to get back and forward to that intimacy. So you could say that framing makes it a bit different from the sheer ache or the sheer sense of something missing, which you would find, as Timothy so wonderfully spelled out for us in somebody like McEwan. And I'd put Vaughan, I suppose, a bit more alongside, this is a wild kind of analogy, a bit more alongside Flannery O'Connor, who of course said about her own short stories, these are stories about grace because they show what grace looks like when it's not there a lot of the time. And I think Vaughan might resonate a bit with that. Big question. And it's a tightrope, isn't it? Because you don't want to go around slapping little post-its saying anonymous Christian on everybody's foreheads in the artistic world. And yet, for art to be worth anything at all, I would say, it has to be saying something about what a life is like that is not alienated. Otherwise, I think art just reflects trauma, and an art that simply reflects trauma doesn't quite get to that further stage of at least evoking the urge towards a non-alienated or reconciled world, yes, something like that. I think that can be said without just saying, well, everybody's saying the same thing.
Yes.
Just a little note, going back to R.S. Thomas and Vaughan, you may not know that there's a selection of Herbert's poems published by Faber, which R.S. Thomas edited and wrote a short introduction to.
Indeed.
So it's quite interesting that he also obviously respected Herbert. Yes.
Yes, indeed. That was one of my early introductions to Herbert. In fact, R.S.'s anthology of Herbert's verse appeared, I think, in the mid-60s. So it was newish when I was studying Herbert at school, and his introduction sort of fed into my own reading of Herbert at the time. I think his introduction is curiously off target. He makes Herbert much more smooth and much more positive than Herbert is, and yet the Herbert who I think mattered and went on mattering to R.S. Thomas was the Herbert of I struck the board and cried no more, and clinging and crying without cease, thou art my God, thou art my peace. You know, that side of Herbert is R.S.'s world. So he went on being important to him, but perhaps I think when he did the anthology for Faber, R.S. was, I think that was a phase when R.S. was trying to be a bit conventionally pious, which is not at all his main forte.
Thank you, Rowan, and thank you, Jack. I'm just reminded of this sort of clinging to the past or clinging to some future and thinking of, in Dries of Ages, Eliot says, you know, men's curiosity searches past and future and clings to that dimension, but the intersection of timelessness with time is the occupation of a saint. And it strikes me that just by thematizing or kind of naming that sense of loss or that worry about the future sort of places oneself right in the middle. So recognizing, as you're saying, that rendering conscious that you are lost and thereby finding yourself in the present. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Indeed, that's very helpful, Joe. Thank you. Yes, I feel when I'm talking about or thinking about Vaughan that I often need to save him from the imputation of just being a dry run for Wordsworth. I don't think it's quite that. I mean, of course, Wordsworth builds on Vaughan in the prelude, no two ways about it, and the Immortality Ode. But I think what makes it a bit different is the way in which Vaughan, if you like, layers this in terms of individual and collective and ecclesial loss in a particular way. And I don't think, he's looking back with nostalgia, with grief, with a sense of bereavement, but we're still all the time brought back to the present moment in his poetry. Okay, so I cannot reach it. Damn it, but now I've got to write a poem. And the poem, here and now, is about why I cannot reach it. And I need to know that, which is why I'm writing the poem, to find out why I cannot reach it. I think that's more how it works. There is a real kind of sinewy quality to Vaughan, which I would say protects him from what I call the imputation of just being the soppiest kind of romantic.
Mike, I think we're getting close to the transition time for you to take over. So why don't this be a transition?
Okay. It's to do with the poet, isn't it? Yeah. It's to do with the poet in himself that you're talking about. But it's not to God. It's not batter my heart, three-person God, is it?
No.
It's a psychological being that he's got. So to what extent do you consider it to be religious poems in relation to, say, Donne's early poems? Or indeed, to what extent, as you started off by talking about it was different from Milton, what is the relationship? It's happening at the same time. Oh, for the warning voice that, yeah. So it's, how do you place that in your context as an archbishop, as a man who's been dedicated to God?
Well, first of all, on the context, I think that the curious thing is how much apocalyptic feeling and rhetoric there is around in the 17th century at both ends of the spectrum. Milton can evoke that warning voice, and indeed already doing it in his very early poetry. Never mind Paradise Lost. Vaughan and some other poets of what you might call the right in the 17th century are doing the same thing. This is the upheaval of evil. This is the as in the imagery here, the breaking open of the waters of chaos almost. So lots of apocalyptic around, and not surprising that it's picked up by both sides. But as to Vaughan's relation with Donne, and no, it's not Batter My Heart, Three-Person God, but I think the poems I've read may give a slightly slanted impression of Vaughan, in that there is really an awful lot of direct address to God. And it's not quite as dramatically staged as Herbert. We don't quite have the intense to and fro that you have in, in The Collar, or in Dialogue, and of course in Love 3. And yet you do have Jesus, my life, how shall I truly love thee? Oh, that thy spirit would so strongly move me that thou art pleased to shed thy grace so far as to make man all pure love, flesh a star that would ne'er set but ever rise, so rise and run as to outrun these skies. He can do that, and he is a prayerful poet. But what I've focused on, rightly or wrongly here, is what I think is one of the things that animates his most complex and challenging poetry, which is this sort of, it's gone. Can't put my finger on it. Something round the corner of your vision, which is immediacy, transparency, reconciliation, and I cannot reach it, but I've got to write about it, because that's the breakthrough into into the prayer.
Can I thank you, Rowan, for just so fabulous.